Good afternoon and welcome to our 20th Franczek webinar since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this week's topic will be employment, leave, FFRCA, oh my. And we're going to address all things employment law, so get your questions ready. We have heard from many that schedules didn't allow for real-time participation, so just wanted to remind you, if you have a colleague that wants to watch, we do record these and post them on our YouTube channel, which I think you can get to from our website, or just go to YouTube and search for Franczek. I'm delighted for those of you who can join us in person and share your hours and your questions and your insights. Today I am joined with our regular panelist, Shelli Anderson. Say hello.
Hello, everyone.
Nicki Bazer, say hello.
Hi, everyone.
And Fattore Crumley, say hello.
Hi, everybody.
So I want to highlight before we get started that next week we will be continuing to host another weekly webinar where next week we're going to tackle all things mask related. So submit your mask questions, get ready for masks next week. As always, if you find yourself looking for more information or not able to get to your questions, please reach out to one of us for information. If you've missed any of our webinars, you can find them on our website, where you can also find other webinars, alerts, blogs, podcasts, much information on our website. Okay, with that, let's get started. So going to start with a question, which I think is kind of the top of mind question. We have lots of districts, both in all various modes of planning. We have some that are still in person, some are remote, some are blended, some are not sure. Dana, can you start us off on this topic and just how do we think through this issue?
So this is really a district specific issue. Everybody has their own community. The rates of infection are different by community. The sensibility of each community is definitely different. Parents have different concerns in different places. And I think that, you know, this is a pressure cooker for everyone that's working in education right now. And school administrators have to respond to concerns of parent groups, of teachers, of public health officials, of people in the community, of people. I mean, certainly there's a big economic impact if we don't go back to school. So those pressures are mounting. So it's not a good situation. You know, obviously we also have to consider resources that are available and whether we have the resources, because operating in person now requires more resources than it did prior to COVID. There's no question about that. You're going to need further resources. So I think when we talk about everything today, we'll be going back and forth between, you know, are you remote? Are you a hybrid? Are you in person? And we'll try to cover all those scenarios.
With that, Shelli, as districts navigate through this, regardless of the choice of model that they're in right now, there are bargaining implications. Can you walk us through what you are seeing in districts that are opening for in-person?
Sure, and I think the important point here is that there's going to be bargaining implications regardless of what the district decides to do, whatever model they have, because the 2021 school year is going to look so different for everyone. With respect to those districts that have a hybrid plan or are going back, you know, or who are opening, obviously the most prevalent one we're seeing is related to PPE, is how are they going to be able to provide it to their students and to their staff, and how they're going to make sure that the students are actually wearing it, and details around that, as well as kind of how are we going to provide hand sanitizer and other cleaning supplies. Another one I'm seeing a lot of is, are the teachers going to be expected to do any of the cleaning? Things like that. Are the teachers going to be expected to take temperatures of kids if they come in? So a lot of bargaining around what those requirements would be, as well as I think one of the other big ones is sick leave and how to handle that. So the idea being that if the district were to tell a teacher, you need to quarantine because a student in your class has COVID, does the teacher have to use their own sick leave if they've already exhausted, for instance, the emergency sick leave? Or is the district going to give them additional sick leave so they don't have to use their own benefit time? So a lot of questions around that, as well as, I mean, I think the evaluation piece is coming up both with respect to the hybrid and the remote idea. And then the one that I'm seeing, physical distancing, we have some MOUs that are requiring that we provide each teacher with a tape measure so they're able to determine how far away the kids are from them. And then the other piece that I think I understand why teachers want to talk about it, but really difficult for districts, is how are we going to control the kids outside of school such that they are following the same procedures that we have in the school to the best extent outside the school, and working on kind of community communications and pledges between families and the school to say, if you want to continue this, we all have to work together and actually make this work. So that's primarily what I'm seeing there.
And Nicki, what are your thoughts on the bargaining issues if a district is going remote at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the crashing in the background. I think it's sort of emblematic of what's going on with most people today. So
my puppy, I'm sorry about that.
No, I think it's a good metaphor for sort of what superintendents and administrators are facing. So yes, I'm sorry, bargaining for remote. So there are issues certainly that districts are facing and they're hearing from their unions on in terms of bargaining for even if they're going fully remote. So the issues that I've seen being most prevalent are, first of all, what does the teacher's day look like? So how much of it is synchronous learning? How much of it is asynchronous? Are you, if your CBA, your collective bargaining agreement actually talks about the hours of the school day that teachers are working, how closely are you adhering to that? What are teachers' expectations in relation to things like checking in on students one-on-one or having office hours or just being available the time that people could access them online? Are they going to be required to teach live or is it going to be videos? Those kinds of things. We're also seeing some questions arise about preparation time. So again, part of that schedule. So those are, I think, are some of the prevalent. I know that we also will start to see questions about evaluation. So can you evaluate teachers when they're remote? For your support staff contracts, again, I know we have some questions coming in and we're going to try to address in terms of what you can use your paraprofessionals for, what you can use your teacher aid for. Are they going to be in the buildings? Are they not? Certainly if you are going all remote and you're requiring your staff to come into the building, and we'll talk about the ramifications of that coming up, that may be a point of negotiation. So we are seeing a number of issues. Dana, I don't know if you have anything else, but I think those are sort of the big ticket items.
Those definitely are the big ticket items. And I think, you raised the $10,000 question is, can a district be remote for students and require the teachers to come in and utilize their classrooms to present their lessons from? And I think generally the answer to that question is yes. It is. I think you can declare that to be essential for many reasons. I mean, obviously you're going to be able to do a much better chemistry class in a chemistry lab, in a lab setting than you will be in your living room. Oftentimes teachers have manipulatives and materials, and it will just feel more like school for the students, I think, if you have the teachers in the setting that students are used to seeing teachers be in. I think there's a misperception, and I don't know if Shelli's had this, but I think I've had a lot of requests from clients who have had teachers come to them and say, well, I want my remote option. So just to be at the very basic level, the remote option is for parents and students to choose under the ISB guidance. It's not been given to teachers. Teachers may have reasonable accommodations that they're entitled to, and that might be an accommodation, but certainly leave is not the only accommodation that they might be entitled to. I mean, Shelli, Nicki, there's other accommodations. What have you been hearing from your clients?
I'll start just quickly. I mean, I think that we are getting a lot of notes from doctors saying, Shelli has this, therefore she needs to be in a remote setting. And when you really dig down into it, the doctor's coming back and saying, this is why. And when you look at this is why, you realize that you don't actually need a remote setting. Those doctors are saying that without having any sense of what the district is actually going to be doing in an open model. So it's really important that interactive process has never been more important, I think, for us to really look at, because so many times I'm finding out that it's just really that the teacher needs to make sure they're wearing a mask. The kids have to be 6 feet away. I've had a number of teachers request that we've been able to accommodate, the plexiglass screen around kind of their front desk area to prevent kids from getting too close if they come up with questions. So just making sure you're talking to everyone. Nicki, I don't know if you're seeing other things.
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, the same holds true. So that, you know, if you're opening, that's going to hold true. And I think just circling back to this issue of what happens if you're opening fully remote, but you're requiring your teachers to come in. So again, digging into that a little bit, because if the teacher is alone in the classroom, there may not be this significant health risks that are being identified. They may not see anybody, or may only see a small number of people during the day. Now, you know, on the flip side of, you know, Dana identified some of the reasons why you may want your teachers to come into the building, even if you're fully remote. I think the flip side of that, of course, is not only the health requests, but because so many districts are opening remotely, you're going to have a lot of teachers talking about childcare issues, and their kids are remote, and so they need to telework from home. And that's just something that a district's going to have to weigh. I think there's some really good reasons to have teachers come into the building, and then there's the converse reasons of just staffing. Are you going to have enough folks who themselves don't have kids at home who are learning remote? The only other thing that I would mention on this front in terms of having staff come into the building is if you decide that you're going to allow your teachers and your paraprofessionals and others to work from home, there may be some circumstances in which you want to have them to come into the building, not all the time, but for specific reasons, right? So there may be, for example, your registration folks, you may want them actually physically in the building for the week before school starts, or there may be some circumstances for assessment that you want teachers present. I know the SAT is going to be, I think, an issue at some point. So I think what Dana said originally is so critical, which is that it's not that teachers get to choose remote. If you guys get to set the rules, in essence, for when you need teachers in the building or when you need staff in the building. And there may be circumstances under which you definitely do.
So let's talk about those circumstances. We're getting questions from registrants. What are valid reasons that employees cannot be on site, a teacher cannot be on site? So can we just list, what do you guys think?
So I think that's a hard question to answer, because it really is, I mean, I know that everyone wants, like, what is the reason that you can't come in? Is it asthma? Is it this? And it isn't that. It requires, I mean, we were talking before we started of just different things that I've received from clients that they've received from their employees. And they've received things like, here's what's on the website of Northwestern Memorial Hospital about higher risk and COVID. And it's just a general thing on the website. Here it is. It says if you have high blood pressure, you should be careful. I have high blood pressure. School, accommodate me. It's never going to be that simple. That's not correct. What you have to have is a form that goes to the employee is going to consult individually with their healthcare provider. They're going to talk about their conditions and what the risks are specific to them, not people with high blood pressure generally, not people with diabetes generally, but you right now. You might be a diabetic and be the healthiest person on the face of the earth, and you really do not need any special accommodation. Yes, you have diabetes, but I've been treating you as your physician, as your endocrinologist for years, and you are really fine as long as they give you a mask, as long as they give the kids masks, and as long as you observe social distancing, you're going to be fine. So it is that specific inquiry that we're looking for. And I know that's not the answer people want, because they'd like to just, you know, put people in piles and say yes to these people, no to these people, but it's still back to the whole ADA analysis.
Yeah, so one group, I think in Jen, this still answers the question, but it's outside the accommodation issue, is related to the FFCRA. So in terms of if someone has their childcare or school unavailable to them because of COVID, those people do get to be at home. And then the district has to decide, are we going to allow them to work remotely, or are we going to let them take their leave? And I think we're going to talk a lot more about leave in general, but I do think that's one area we have to remember. Those people can, you know, they can work from home if you let them. So
Right.
So before we move off of just the question of in or out of the building, Nicki, are there certain circumstances when you do need staff? Let's say we're not globally requiring staff to teach from their rooms. Are there other circumstances where you might need some staff in the building?
Yeah, I had mentioned before, I think, you know, you might need your registration folks in for a week before school starts. Again, proctoring the SAT, if you're doing a fall SAT, might come up. There may be circumstances where, you know, you have a professional development that can't, for some reason, you need the teachers in person rather than remote in terms, I mean, I think there are a number of circumstances where, you know, again, you're not dictating sort of the day-to-day, they can telework, but there are moments where you need specific groups of folks to come in. And we certainly did this, we saw this in the spring as well, in the sense that, like, for example, we had custodians, of course, coming in to do various things in the building, or maintenance folks. So again, there may be circumstances, and I do want to say, and I know this question comes up a lot, which is, well, is it, you know, people, employees will say, well, it's unfair, you know, one teacher gets to stay at home, and one teacher needs to come in, or one person needs to come in. The district gets to decide that based on its staffing needs and its program needs. I know, and this is something Jen and Dana can speak to, and I think there may be circumstances where the district wants to run a couple of small group programs for kids with specific special education needs. It may not be always, but they may want to do some touch points with students, not physically touching, but touch points with students at certain times. And those teachers may need to come in. This is not really a fairness issue. What it's about is carrying out the educational programming and the operational supports of a district while we run a program for students, regardless of whether it's full remote, hybrid, or whatnot. So you have that discretion as districts to make those decisions.
Great. So turning to a topic for those viewers who are with us from the beginning, this was a topic we talked about much in the spring, and now it's back, which is stipends. So Shelli, walk us through whether a district needs to pay stipends this fall.
Okay, so we have to remember that last, you know, in March or April, ISB came out and said that we had to continue paying all staff as we normally would have had COVID not been here. And that continued to the end of last school year. That does not apply, we determined, during summer school or during this next school year. We've not heard anything yet that ISB is going to come out and make that proclamation. I don't anticipate they will, but who knows, it could be coming out now while we're speaking. So in terms of a stipend issue, what you need to be sure to look at is your collective bargaining agreement. That is going to be what's going to dictate how and when you have to pay your stipends. Many districts have time periods in there that if you aren't told by a particular date, the stipend isn't going to run, for instance, that you need to pay it. Now, this is also an area that I would really recommend some bargaining around with respect to that. Now, even if you're in a remote environment, however, you could still run some extracurricular programs, either remotely or even in person in some way, and certainly we're seeing that with athletics, but also clubs. I mean, depending upon how you were able to staff that, if they could do it outside, things like that. So working with the union on if it's going to look different and not be quite the same amount of time, for instance, could the amount of that stipend then be less? And again, that's a point that you need to bargain with the unions. You also have to look at, with respect to retirees, for instance, if you're going to let them have their stipended position, how is that going to affect their retirement? And could that ultimately result in a penalty for the district if they don't do it this year, for instance, but then they're given back the stipend the following year? So there's a lot of implications with that.
Okay, so not just stipend positions, but also turning to anticipated changes of needs possibly for the fall with going remote. Nicki, if we talked about this going earlier in the year, but now that districts are going remote again, what happens if they do not need all their support staff? Can changes be made now?
Yeah, so we definitely hit on this in the spring, and I think it's a good reminder and refresher. So as most folks probably know, the school code allows you to reduce and force the number of your paraprofessionals with 30 days notice. Now, this is not always the case. You have to look, if you have a collective bargaining agreement with your support staff, you need to look to that. There's some collective bargaining agreements require the same type of notice last spring that the districts must use for teachers, but hopefully many of your CBAs do allow for a 30-day RIF notice. Shelli, I know this is something that's coming up in negotiations as well, and also just sort of the issue of the other thing that's going to be in your collective bargaining agreement likely is the bumping issue of, you know, which support staff can bump into which positions and whether that's dictated by your CBA. So I don't know, Shelli, have you seen that? Is that coming up in some of your bargaining?
Yeah, I think that part of it. So in terms of there might be, if you're going remote, it's likely you do not need all the support staff that you would otherwise need in the building. With the recognition, however, that just because you're remote for a undefined time period, we're all going to eventually, God help us, get back to in-person instruction in a normal school world. So what I've seen is some districts entering into agreements with their support staff union to say, you know, we are going to follow a different RIF process. So we're going to RIF those positions we don't need, but typically there's a bumping, and sometimes there's even a bumping between positions that would really just be disruptive if we were only doing that for this short period of time and then 3 months later calling everyone back. So I have seen some agreements between districts and unions to say, we're going to RIF these people, we're going to guarantee them that we're going to call them back as soon as we have in-person instruction. And during that time period, those people can get unemployment. But ultimately, we're not going to do the bumping so that we don't have to be so disruptive of who's in which position when we come back.
Yeah, and I think that's super important. And I just want to, I know this was another point that we addressed in the spring, but just to put a fine point on it, which is that there's really not a concept of furloughs within usually within a CBA, or there's occasion, I know there's a couple that might have that, but in terms of the school code, we don't really speak in terms of furlough. So what Shelli is sort of, you know, describing the idea of sort of riffing, which is the process we use for support staff, but with this idea of bargaining a recall process, is I think where districts want to go, if that's what they're sort of looking for, the concept of furlough really not being the one to use in this circumstance.
So also regarding support staff, there's a question that came in the Q&A about, for those doing remote, how can districts utilize paraprofessionals? Dana, you know, can they be online alone with students? If it's allowed during a Zoom break, or the teacher would bounce to Zoom, that's the question. Do you have thoughts on that?
So, right, paraprofessionals can be used for non-instructional activities. If they're going to be doing some sort of instructional activity, they've got to be working with a teacher. So I do think that you can use paraprofessionals to supervise students, to assist teachers, to make sure kids are, you know, logging on, getting what they need. As far as sometimes when you're, we know from doing Zoom, those of us who have done Zoom where we have participants and you have maybe 50, hopefully in schools you won't have 50, but we've had, you know, we've all done speeches where we have 50 participants, and having another point person to just make sure that if someone raises a hand or someone waves to you, that you're seeing it when you have that many boxes on your screen is just a good use of paraprofessionals. There's another question about, what about riffing one-to-one aids? Because if you're doing a full remote program and the student is not using their one-to-one aid, I would be cautious about that. I mean, I think obviously you need to riff if you're not using people, but I would be worried about going specifically for one-to-one aids, because I think that might cause a special ed issue, especially as you're looking at your remote learning plans and how those aids are going to be utilized. What do you think, Jen? Is that a warning for you too?
Yeah, well, you need to look, have you gone through your process? Are those minutes still in the IEP, or have you done a remote learning plan that removes them and that the parents agreed to? If not, really that one-to-one aid should still be a one-to-one remote support, unless you've, like I said, gone through the process to remove that from a service that the student's entitled to.
Right. I mean, I don't see one-to-one aid as sort of a position that you might think about riffing universally. I think those types of positions are more like the people that monitor the hallway. Well, if you don't have kids in the hallway, you might not need the hallway monitors, but the one-on-one aid has a function on the IEP. The instructional aids have functions in the classroom. So you want to be careful about how you adjust those, because they might, it's not just a labor thing, it's also an educational programming issue.
I think as far as staffing though, you guys, I mean, in terms of who you decide you're going to RIF, I think we need to really be forward thinking about this, because even if you believe you have a certain number of teachers who are going to be able to be in your building, if you're going back to an in-person instruction, there are going to be times when either there has to be a quarantine that happens, or that person just gets sick, or perhaps that teacher's own child's school decides to go remote, so they suddenly have to put in for a childcare leave. So being able to have staff in your building who know the kids, who the kids know, who can be the person responsible for, you know, turning on the screen for the teacher who's working remotely now, the kids are in the classroom so that there's supervision by someone that they know. I just think that's going to be a lot better than having some, random sub come in and do that work.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think this is a situation where you want to be prudent, but you don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish, and if what you do results in parent complaints and kids not getting what they need, it's not worth it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things we talked about in the spring was, we understand that districts are in, there are fiscal issues at play here, and that may indeed result in needing to RIF. One of the things about paras, I know in particular, aides, is that I know a lot of districts have a really hard time finding enough aides, both one-to-one and classroom aides. And so, I mean, to the extent that you can utilize them, as Shelli and Dana and Jen have all identified, in various capacities, and you can continue on with them, or at least, promise that recall pretty quickly, the better chance you are at retaining staff that you really want to keep on board. So, I mean, obviously a lot of moving parts to that calculation.
So Nicki, on that point, this is kind of a specific teacher aide question that came in during registration. Someone had a teacher aide stating they could not work around children during the pandemic period. And they asked, could they issue a 30-day notice for dismissal since they don't have remote positions or work from home positions? This kind of as a fact pattern that brings us to life a little bit, what we've been talking about. What are your thoughts?
Right. I mean, certainly if you need to RIF staff because you have too many staff and you don't need to utilize them, you can do an overall RIF. But with this situation, you have to be really careful. If a teacher aide says, if they actually have medical, I mean, that they cannot work around children seems a little broad to me, but assuming that you drill down and you actually have a medical condition that requires an accommodation or a leave, if you cannot accommodate them because you don't have such positions where an aide can work remotely, then you need to look at whether they are entitled to benefit leave. So again, you're going down the road of, are they eligible for FFCRA? Are they eligible to take whatever sick leave they might have? Once they exhaust leave, is there some sort of accommodation leave unpaid that you have to provide them? So you certainly can't just RIF someone if they are stating that they have a medical concern or a medical issue that prevents them from coming into the building. So again, case by case, but we're going to want to really dig into that to make sure that you are offering them any benefit leave that they are entitled to.
Great. And so another more specific scenario to bring some of this to life, a little bit different topic though. Let's say you had a daily symptom screener, and Dana, I'm going to throw this one to you, and an employee indicates he has a runny nose. And when the district talks to him, the employee says he's sure it's just seasonal allergies and he wants to come to work. Is there any response that, what is your advice in that situation, Dana?
So, I mean, I think we have to sort of, first of all, unpack this a little bit. When people are checking off boxes, I think the way the screener is supposed to work is that we're not contacting them necessarily, they're just not coming in. So, I mean, that would be sort of my interpretation. I mean, if someone has a question about the screener, like let's sort of train this around, maybe he checks that he has a runny nose and then he has a question about it. I think we have to go back to, when you have these questions and you're going into a place of business, they're asking you in a very specific context, is this a new symptom? If you're allergic to cats and you are holding Fluffy and your nose is running, right? You should not necessarily be saying yes to my nose is runny, because it's not really, if you know that you're allergic to cats and they make you violently ill and you are holding a cat, that's a very broad example. I think to me, the way the symptom screener works, and I would love to hear from the other panelists, but if you check something, you are staying home. If you are checking and you say, I have this symptom, you are staying home until it resolves, and then you're following the guidelines for what constitutes it being resolved. Whether it be you go to your physician, you get a negative test, you quarantine for a period.
I think the tough thing about that though, and I use this example with a group I was talking to yesterday, is, it was like 7 o'clock at night and I had this raging headache, and we were talking about this exact thing in relation to bargaining. And I said, You know, I have a headache. If someone asks me right now, do you have any of these symptoms? But I have a headache because I've been staring at a Zoom camera for 10 hours today. And I know that's why, and I haven't drank enough water. But I think that gets tricky because if you're just answering as a yes or no, do you have a headache? Yes. But would I think that it'd be something that would preclude me from going into a place of business that was asking, or going to my dentist appointment? The answer would be no. And I think that that's where it gets really tricky, what these self-certification questions really are and what they're intended to be. So I think we have to be just mindful of that and all use a little bit of common sense.
Right.
All right, so different topic. What is happening with teacher evaluation? Shelli.
I'm going to preview that, next week we're going to talk about masks, and hopefully the week after that we're going to talk about evaluations, because we're hopeful to have some more information from the state if it's coming, maybe by then. But I think in the world of evaluations, we have unions taking very different positions on what should happen this year. I mean, there are some unions taking the position that we cannot evaluate because the statute says that there has to be in-person evaluation in the classroom, and taking the position that in the classroom means in a physical space. I personally do not agree with that position. While we have other unions taking the position of, we will agree that you will only evaluate our probationary staff, even if it's a remote environment. We won't evaluate, excuse me, tenured staff, and what their rating will be is then often a point of bargaining. And that's what I think we'll see from ISB perhaps, is how last year they said that we could have the default to excellent if someone had received an excellent prior to that. We might see an extension of that this year. Nicki, don't you think we'll see that?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the statutory change already for just the excellent piece. We have a really amazing luck of sort of shouting out to ISB on these webinars, and then they actually produce something. So hopefully there will be some guidance. I'm hoping, though, that it is not as strict as the last joint guidance, and to the extent that folks are on committees or are on task force that are reporting to the powers that be at the state level, I think we really need to discourage the idea that evaluation should not be taking place. The spring was a mess, right? Everybody thought that they were going to be remote for maybe a couple weeks, and then we ended up remote through the entire rest of the school year. Everybody was new to remote teaching. It was the right thing to sort of put some of these things on hold. But I think that as we go remote, as a lot of districts start remote or hybrid in the fall, and we really don't, although some districts have set end deadlines, we really don't know what is to come. I think we're going to need accountability, right? At the very minimum, we're going to be wanting to evaluate those probationary teachers, the teachers that are struggling. I think the idea that there's a lot of parents are going to insist that they see a different level of performance amongst their teachers. We had a lot of amazing teachers last spring really step up to the plate, but then there were some where it felt like you sort of lost your teacher, right? And so some level of accountability. As Shelli said, we're going to talk about this. Hopefully we'll see some guidance coming out, or we might even see some statutory changes. But more to come on that. At this point, we're sort of circling on status quo.
So we talked about AIDS. We did get a question that came in that I know that we've internally talked about a lot. Just asking again for clarification on, can AIDS be used, or just to be clear, AIDS can be used to supervise and assist a teacher in a Zoom call. But what about providing reading instruction for small groups? And Nicki, if you want to start us off with that.
Yeah, and I know this has been sort of a raging discussion about what you can use aids for, but I think it is clear that you cannot use a para for direct instruction unless they are under this direct, excuse me, let me back up. You can't use them for instruction of students unless they are under the direct supervision of a teacher. And so if that teacher is somehow in that small group or can oversee that small group reading, then you might be able to do it. But if the TA or the para is on their own sort of Zoom out, a breakout or a Google Meet breakout session, and the teacher is not directly supervising them, then you get into a problem using an aid in that way. Dana, I think you would agree with that.
I agree with that. I think that there are probably some ways you could allow that to happen. If you had a teacher, and again, we're going back to if you require the kids to be remote, but everybody's in the building, and you had a teacher and an aide working in the same large classroom, socially distanced, they have the same computer, they're looking at the same screen, and the teacher says to the aide, run through these 4 comprehension questions with this group, my reading group A. I'm going to run through them with group B, write down what they say, and they're in the same room. I think that would work. But I think somebody in their living room in one part of town and somebody in their living room in a different part of town is not going to meet what the statute says right now, because that is going to be an aid providing instruction without that direct oversight of a licensed teacher.
I think where we have to, and it gets kind of murky, I think, is that some, say, IEP supports, like, let's say a student had an accommodation of chunking assignments, or so they get the large group assignment with the teacher, and then they have an aide that's supposed to help facilitate chunking. They're not providing instruction, they're supporting the accommodation of chunking. But sometimes chunking, if you observed it, might look like instruction. You know, instruction. So it's really a fine line, and I guess right now, on one hand, what we're hesitant about is that we give all instructional duties to aides because, you know, especially in certain circumstances where they're willing to be in person. But what we don't want to be so rigid about is we need a lot of flexibility right now just to make this work. And yeah, I mean, so we don't want what we're saying to be interpreted too, you know, rigidly, so that it just
right.
nobody's getting what they need, you know.
Right, and I think there's a difference. I think for sort of an easy way to think about it is there's a difference between helping somebody with their homework and kind of that old school resource model before we RTI'd everybody to death, and providing instruction. And providing instruction, if the aid is simply just saying, okay, what are we going to do first? What are we going to do next? Let's write the topic sentence, or here's what the teacher said to do. How do we make this work for you? That's instructional aid kind of stuff. Actually telling somebody, like, this is how you make an inference, or I'm going to read this with you and we're going to, and I think it is a very fine line, but we have to be, I think, flexible to allow for the greatest interaction, especially with kids at certain points in their learning. That the more they can interact with an adult, I think is better.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And the context of this question leads me to believe that there might be circumstances, and I think, Jen, this is sort of what you were speaking to, where you might have like a teacher who's running an overall session for a group of students, and you might have a couple of breakouts that are being handled by aides, and the teacher is sort of going between the groups. I mean, is that technically compliant with the rule in the statute? I mean, we could debate that until we're blue in the face. Is that something that ultimately is going to serve the benefit of the students and allow the teacher some flexibility in making sure that the students get a lot of different small group, learning? I think yes. And if we want to, I think, it's possible that ISB will come out with some more guidance, but I think in the meantime, if that's what you're sort of setting up, I do think we're going to get a lot of grace in terms of our flexibility on some of these things so that we can provide instruction to students.
So shifting gears, Shelli, Chicago has a mandatory quarantine for residents who travel to specific states, and Cook County Health Department has recommended quarantine as well. Do you have any recommendations for school districts, even outside of Cook County, who are trying to think about how these quarantine either requirements or guidance it should be implemented?
Yeah, so in terms of, I think the point this is coming up quite a bit with is teachers taking their kids to college and dropping them off. And if they're dropping them off in one of these states that then either requires the quarantine because you're living in Chicago, or there's a recommended quarantine and you're living in Cook County, or really, we should probably all be mindful of these particular states that are considered higher risk. But I think that looking at making sure that you realize that if you have to be there for at least 24 hours, and I know that we're not necessarily always, if you're dropping your child off, going to be there for 24 hours, but if you are, then there would be likely a need for a quarantine. I think discussing with staff generally about this idea of, not making a decision to go up to Wisconsin for Labor Day if we know we're starting in-person instruction shortly after Labor Day, things like that, because in that instance, that quarantine piece of it would obviously be, if you required it, it would eat up that teacher's availability to use their 10 days of emergency sick leave, and we haven't even gone back to school yet, potentially, and they'd have that. They're also, in terms of the definition of essential workers, teachers are in that definition. And I think you have to drill down a little bit on the different pieces of what that actually looks like, because it's deep in the definition of them being a government worker. So I have a few districts I work with who have teachers who live in either Indiana or Wisconsin. And I don't think Indiana is currently on the list, but Wisconsin is. And that talks about that if you have someone who's working in Cook County but lives outside of Cook County, if they have to travel here for work, that quarantine rule does not apply to them, which would mean that you could then require your Wisconsin employee, Wisconsin living resident to come into work, and they wouldn't have to quarantine. So I think that's just generally my recommendations around that.
So Dana, another hot topic, COVID liability. If a student or a staff member gets sick or worse and the family sues, so a registrant asks, what are our chances in the court of law? Understanding that there's also a public relations issue. The question acknowledged that, but what do we think about the liability in court?
So I think this is the $10,000 question, and I know everyone worries about this, and I hope that the answer to this does put some people's minds a little bit at ease. I mean, certainly we don't want anyone to get sick, but I think, the reason that we've put out some of the documents that we've put out, the safety checklist, the reason, we have Illinois Department of Public Health, we have Cook County about these guidelines, and I know it's confusing, and I'm not saying that, there's one true way to follow this, but as long as you are following it and doing in good faith, you're making a good faith effort to make sure that your district is following these rules and guidelines, I think the chances that you being held liable for someone becoming ill are very, very remote. That being said, there's always an exception to that rule, but generally I think this is a remote type of lawsuit where a court would find you liable. And I think that's why we talked about earlier in our presentations on this webinar, it talked about like adopting reopening plans and, looking at the Tort Immunity Act and making sure that you're taking steps as a district and putting in protocols that will help you avail that protection that's already in the Tort Immunity Act and help you access that. So, don't go and become sick and cough in someone's face. We can't help you then. Refrain from that. But if you follow the guidelines, I don't think there's very much risk of lawsuits in this area. There's always going to be lawsuits, but an actual finding of liability, I think, is low risk.
So it was in the title of our webinar this week, FFRCA. We are getting questions about it. Shelli, what are you seeing this week as far as issues with FFRCA?
So this is coming up a lot right now as all the HR folks who are listening are going through their accommodation requests and going through all the child care leave requests. So just kind of at a very high level, a reminder that under the FFCRA, there are 10 days of paid sick leave at 100% of the person's rate of pay or $511 maximum for a variety of reasons, including if you yourself get sick from COVID, if you're taking care of someone with COVID, and those are the 10 days that are available. There's also the portion that I think most people in school districts are dealing with right now is this expanded FMLA leave that is under the FFCRA. And what that is a maximum of 12 weeks of leave if your child care place of business or school is unavailable due to COVID, which would mean that all of our teachers who've got younger children who perhaps their schools have gone remote, their school is unavailable to send their child to, so they would all potentially qualify. The piece that I think is getting lost in this is that it is 12 weeks total inclusive of any FMLA leave that you've already used. So it's not an additional 12 weeks. It's if you've already used 6 weeks, for instance, you only then have the availability for 6 weeks of this other leave. And that's paid at 2/3 with a maximum of $200. So that's quite a bit different in terms of, I know many of our teachers make more than that per diem. So that is at a discounted rate of pay, but you don't have to use your own benefit time for it. So that's, in thinking through all these staffing issues, I feel like I'm in a bit of a tornado because I feel like every time a district is able to figure out how to staff their own hybrid plan, they then have a number of teachers who've got kids in other districts putting in for leave saying, well, now my district has gone remote and therefore I can no longer be an in-person instructor. And the district that was otherwise going to be able to handle this now doesn't have enough teachers in their building to actually staff a hybrid program. And now this all currently expires at the end of December. We'll see if it's extended. But I certainly see this as becoming a very significant issue for our districts.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add one quick point. I think, Shelli, you may have said this, but just to be clear, the 10 days of ESL is paid at 100% if you're taking the leave for yourself. But if you're caring for others or you're caring for a child, for example, whose school is closed, then even the ESL is at that 2/3 rate with the $200 cap. Now, again, districts we know can offer that an employee use their own sick leave to sort of supplement, but they don't have to. And so they could be kept to that cap.
Right, and I think it's worth mentioning some of the ways that districts are dealing with this, or just some of the ideas that are being floated out there. I know, Shelli, you and I were texting about, you know, for teachers that can't come in, having superintendents allowing teachers to bring their kids into work. And I've had a few requests like that, or allowing the kids to come and be students.
Yeah. We're definitely seeing those kind of unique requests come in to try to figure out ways, and you're all being so creative, and the more creative you are, I think the more likely you are to be able to make this work. But those are certainly two things we've seen a lot of in the last few weeks.
Yeah, and we got a question in that's sort of along these lines, is what happens after the EFMLA runs out and if childcare is still not available and the person cannot work remotely. So again, just to remind folks, I think that the question raises this, like, you know, if your teacher can telework while their kid is home, like that's great. But if they can't, all of the creative ideas on the table here, but if at the end of the day those don't work, then you're talking about potentially an unpaid, you know, discretionary leave for the teacher, or they just need to leave your employee, unfortunately, because at some point that leave will be exhausted unless, again, it's enhanced or extended or more leave is offered at the federal level.
And so I also want, on the same topic, FFRCA, there was a notable court decision out of New York. Can you, Shelli, talk about what, if anything, should districts think about that decision?
Yeah, so I think we did put out an alert related to the New York federal court decision that decided that the Department of Labor's position with respect to FFCRA was too broad in a number of respects, and that alert is available on our website. I think in terms of how districts should handle it, the most significant for the districts that I work with, at least, was this notion of currently the Department of Labor regulations indicate that you do not have to allow intermittent leave under the FFCRA for childcare, whereas we all know under the FMLA, if it's requested, we do have to allow for intermittent leave. What this decision out of New York said is that that is not permissible, that we have to be able to allow teachers to take it intermittently. If you can imagine what that would look like then in terms of your staffing issues already, if you were going to have to determine, well, Shelli can come in Mondays and Wednesdays and Nicki can come in Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it's going to make it even more difficult. The reason I don't see this as such a big issue is I think many of the districts that I work with it's not a matter of those teachers taking leave. They're just being permitted to work remotely. And then it's a question of if their children are going to school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, is that leave then not available for them for those 2 days such that they have to come in and report to work on those 2 days? So I think as we get more information as to whether or not this decision is appealed, whether or not the Department of Labor pulls back on their regulations such that it is applicable to everyone, not just in New York, we will certainly let you know and keep you apprised of that.
Okay, so Nicki, many of us are still confused, so I'll just ask another FFRCA question. So please confirm the understanding if a staff may use FFRCA for childcare when schools are open but remote learning only. And what if a teacher's school is offering both in-person and remote as the teacher's option for their child? What impact does that have?
Right. So under the FFCRA, if a teacher's school, their children's school is closed, they are doing remote learning only, then the teacher can take FFCRA leave. However, the position that we're taking at this point legally is that if a teacher's school, their children's school, I should say, if a teacher's child's school is offering both an in-person option and a remote option, then it is not in fact closed and they cannot take FFCRA leave. Again, potentially we'll see more regulation on that, but that is certainly the position we are taking at this point. And then again, all those intermittent questions start flowing in from there.
So, sorry about that. Going to another question, Dana. I think we talked about this a little bit, but can you just clarify again? Would it be allowed if a district is requiring teachers to teach from their classroom? Can, as an accommodation, they allow the teacher to bring their own child to the classroom due to a lack of their own school, the child's school being open for in-person? Would that be all right?
So we've had a lot of questions about this, and I do think that generally this is acceptable. There's no law that bars it. I do think it might be a bargaining issue though, because some teachers may not feel comfortable if there's absolutely no kids in the classroom and then we're bringing in just kids of teachers. That's changing the setting a little bit. So you might need to discuss that with the union. You know, what you're going to do with them. I think you have to do it in a careful way. Like you can't just let them run around and not have any supervision. I think once they're in the building, you need to have some supervision of them. And I'm not sure that teachers can really supervise their own kids and be teaching at the same time. So I think it's possible. I think you're going to have to look at, you know, creative utilization of instructional support staff. And I would make it an issue to raise with the union. I wouldn't just do it without talking about it.
I think it's a community issue also though. I mean, as the four of us were talking about earlier, is if you suddenly let all your teachers bring their kids in to school, even if they're just sitting in the back of their classroom, your community, who may very well want their own children to be at school, may start to wonder, why is it safe for all of those kids to be there and our kids are still learning remotely? So I would just be careful. That might be the only option you have, but I would just warn districts to be careful about that.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. I think if you have some in-person learning, it's a different inquiry than if you are totally remote.
Yeah. And it certainly falls in the category of, you know, no good options. And so it's like, okay, that's not a good option, but given this other, you know, okay, so if you don't allow it, then the teacher has to take the leave because they have nothing else to do with their children. And then what is your alternative to filling that position? And so we understand people are making very difficult decisions right now. Dana, and I know I've been saying the wrong letters here, the FFCRA, any more examples that you can give of that?
So, I mean, again, just to sort of run through like why someone might take leave. They could take leave for their own health condition, and we've discussed that that's got to be individualized. But if somebody, I actually just think of an example that a client gave me where the teacher is going to access leave. And that's a teacher that was undergoing chemotherapy for cancer. So they were on intermittent leave and they've decided based on their doctor's advice that they're just going to take 12 weeks of leave because the district they're working in is going back to a in-person model and based on their personal reaction to the chemotherapy. So that's a clear example. That gives you an example at least. You can take leave if someone else, if you're caring for someone else. So it's, you know, similar to the FMLA leave that you would take. And then obviously you can take leave for childcare purposes, and Shelli's gone through how the pay might be different. You also have to always, when you're dealing with the FFCRA, I think you have to, especially when you're dealing with it for an employee's health condition, you have to look at how your district handles FMLA generally and what the union contract says and what the board policy says about how people utilize their sick leave and how their benefits run and all of that. That is something that you need to look at and apply under these types of leaves as well.
Yeah, and I would remind everybody that we do have a great guide that sort of takes you through all the sort of permutations of FFCRA and ADA accommodation leave. So if anybody needs that still, feel free to hit us up for it.
All right, we're going to do some rapid fire fact or fiction to end us off here, unless we have a little more time after that. But Dana, fact or fiction? Teachers have to be allowed to telework if the district is going fully remote.
Fiction. That is fiction. You have to accommodate teachers, and you might have a situation or two where that's the accommodation, but it is not a right for teachers to just work remotely.
All right, Nicki, fact or fiction? Using general guidance to the public from a physician's association is enough to request leave or on a reasonable, as a reasonable accommodation? Fact or fiction?
Fiction. We cannot base an accommodation on the fact that the American Physicians Association tells us that COVID is dangerous. We know that COVID is dangerous. That is not enough. We need an individualized doctor's certification or assessment as to why the person needs an accommodation, which could be leave or another accommodation in the building.
Shelli, fact or fiction? If a teacher's child school is offering both in-person and remote, and they choose remote, are they entitled to FFCRA leave?
Fiction. As we talked about before, you only receive FFCRA leave for childcare if your school or daycare is unavailable. And it's our position that if they're offering in-person learning, that school is not unavailable.
Okay. Nicki, fact or fiction? A teacher goes to visit the Cornhuskers and spends the whole weekend moving her son into college. Do they need to quarantine upon return?
So I have learned this morning what a Cornhusker is. So congrats to all you Nebraska folks. I am from the East Coast. These are new things for me. Fact and fiction. This one's a complicated one, right? So if you are in Cook County, certainly if you're in Chicago, we have the quarantine order. So you would have to quarantine if you spent the whole weekend, which is more than 24 hours. Likewise in Cook County, Shelli has sort of described their recommended guidance on that. Outside, we have not seen those kinds of travel restrictions yet. They may be yet to come. So it depends on where your school district is and where your teacher is.
Great, well, that was fun. If people, in addition to registration questions, if you want to submit fact or fiction questions going forward, I think that needs to be a recurring theme here. All right, we maybe got one or two more questions here. Accommodations, Dana, can you talk about other creative things you're seeing as far as accommodating different concerns of teachers, medical concerns?
So this is not necessarily a teacher accommodation, but I thought this was a good accommodation for an office employee who was, again, not in a bargaining unit because it did involve working hours. So I want to make that clear, but a person had a doctor's note that they really shouldn't be around others and they needed to observe strict social distancing, and the school district office was opening. But the particular job, the person needed to access software that had to do with payroll and hours and things like that. And the district did offer an accommodation where their hours were shifted. So they came in before school started for a time or after school, after the business day closed. And that allowed the person to still do their job and still access. So I do think you need to really think outside the box. You know, looking at different types of PPE. Shelli mentioned some of the things, the plexiglass. We all love plexiglass now. It's such a wonderful substance. So
Yeah,
those types of things.
One thing I just want to add about accommodations that I don't think we've said is, and I'm getting a lot of questions about this, is that just because you give one person one accommodation does not mean that another person gets the same accommodation necessarily, even if they necessarily have the same disability. You know, it really does have to be so case specific. And so, for instance, we have a teacher who might request to work from home and we don't have a remote teaching position, but perhaps your office manager or your bookkeeper does need to also request to work from home, but they can fulfill their job at home.
Right.
That's an okay distinction to make there. That's not going to be prohibited.
Right. It's very much based on what your need is. Is the accommodation meeting the need, but also what the job requires. So just because an employee wants a particular accommodation doesn't mean that's the one you're going to give them. You're going to give them one that meets the need, not necessarily their number one choice.
Hey, Jen, I see a bunch of questions coming in about just return to work. I just wanted, I don't know that we have time to delve into all of this. Is what if someone tests positive or negative? These are really complicated questions. I do want to just shout out that we have a protocol on this if anybody needs. There's a lot of shifting guidance on this front. There's no doubt that confusion is warranted here. So I'm happy to answer those questions offline or get you our current protocols on those, because I know those are confusing questions.
Great. So just wanted to thank everyone for attending this week and remind everyone we'll be back next week on masks. So both employees, students, community members, your lawyers, who needs a mask and everything. So look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for joining.